They were not mere soldiers, they were the blade in the hand of the empire, forged in silence and obedience, then unleashed with terrifying precision. For centuries, the Janissaries moved through the Ottoman world like a shadowed tide, unquestioned, unchallenged, and often uncontrolled. They reshaped cities, dethroned rulers, and haunted the corridors of palaces with a presence that inspired awe and dread alike. What they did is not just part of Ottoman history, it is a legacy of fear carved into the very bones of civilization. Forced child recruitment, the Devshirme System. It began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet corners of Christian villages across the Balkans, where boys disappeared from their homes, taken not by invaders in the night, but by royal decree. Known as the Devshirme, or collection, this system served as the lifeblood of the Janissary Corps. It was a mechanism of power, precise and institutionalized, whereby Christian families under Ottoman rule were required to surrender their sons, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, to the Sultan. Once taken, the boys were converted to Islam and subjected to years of intense training. Every aspect of their previous identity was stripped away not through chaos, but through method. They were not merely trained to fight, they were remade to serve. Selected for intelligence, strength, and obedience, they were taught Turkish, drilled in military discipline, and immersed in the code of absolute loyalty to the Sultan. This was not simply a military academy, it was a machine designed to erase the self and build an elite. As the 17th century historian Dimitri Cantemir observed, the Grand Signior has no slaves more faithful than those he has taken from their own fathers. The irony was chilling. What began as forced recruitment became, over time, a gateway to extraordinary power. Many of these boys rose through the ranks to command armies, govern provinces, and even whisper in the ears of emperors. Yet their origins were never forgotten by the empire, nor by those who lived under its shadow. The Devshirme was more than a policy. It was a calculated reshaping of society, a quiet conquest that required no sword. And it left generations caught between two worlds belonging to both, yet owned by neither. Elite warriors turned political kingmakers. At their height, the Janissaries were not merely the Sultan's personal guard, they were the spine of the Ottoman war machine. Trained to march without fear, to fire without hesitation, and to die without question. They were feared across continents, but as their power grew, so too did their ambitions. The very force designed to uphold imperial rule began to shape it from within. Originally forbidden to marry, own property, or engage in trade, the Janissaries were expected to live solely for the state. But by the late 16th century, these restrictions began to loosen. With their immense influence on military campaigns and urban life, they embedded themselves deep into the heart of Ottoman society. Wealth flowed into their ranks. Families began to bribe officials to place their sons into what was once an involuntary course. The Janissary became not just a soldier but a status. Over time, their presence extended beyond the battlefield and into the corridors of power. They influenced appointments to high office, dictated the terms of succession, and even weighed in on foreign policy. They were kingmakers, cloaked not in gold but in uniform. A force once formed in silence now spoke louder than ministers, and while the Sultan still sat on the throne, the Janissaries had the power to tilt it. What began as a disciplined brotherhood had evolved into a state within a state. Bound by loyalty, but driven by power, they blurred the line between protector and master. And the empire, once their creator, would increasingly become their captive. Janissary uprisings that shook the empire when the Janissaries rose. It was not with chaotic rage, but with a terrifying sense of order. These were not random rebellions. They were calculated displays of force aimed squarely at the heart of Ottoman authority. And over time, they became a defining threat within the empire. as dangerous as any enemy beyond its borders. From the 17th century onward, Janissary revolts became alarmingly frequent. What had once been a loyal military elite now openly challenged the very rulers they swore to protect. In 1622, their fury culminated in one of the most shocking moments in Ottoman history, the deposition of Sultan Osman II, known as Osman the Young. He attempted to curb their growing influence by creating a rival army. The Janissaries responded not with negotiation, but with insurrection. The palace was overrun. The Sultan was imprisoned and would not leave his cell alive. But it was in 1656 that the unrest reached a dark and almost surreal crescendo Vakai Vakvaki, the event of the Vakvak tree. Frustrated by mismanagement, inflation, and the continued abuse of Janissary power, the people of Istanbul and elements of the military took a dangerous turn. A list of targeted officials was nailed to a tree in the capital, those accused of corruption, failure, or betrayal of public trust. One by one, these individuals were hunted down. Their bodies were strung from the trees as branches in the public square, a grim parody of justice meant to echo through the palace walls. This macabre event was not just a riot, it was a reckoning. The symbolism was unmistakable. The state had lost control not only of its soldiers, but of its soul. The Vakvak tree, named after a mythical tree that bore the heads of the damned, became a real-life emblem of rebellion and bloodless governance. The empire survived the chaos, but the wound festered. The Janissaries had proven, yet again, that they could shake the pillars of power not by defending the state, but by bending it to their will. The silent executions within the palace walls, not all struggles within the Ottoman Empire were fought on battlefields or in open rebellion. Some of the most decisive power shifts unfolded behind the high walls of Topkapi Palace, quiet, calculated, and almost entirely invisible to the public eye. In this world of shadows, the Janissaries were not only enforcers of imperial will, they were also instruments in the careful removal of those who stood in its way. As political tensions deepened, sultans and grand viziers increasingly relied on the Janissaries to carry out covert eliminations. High-ranking officials who fell out of favor could vanish overnight, their names struck from records, their legacies erased with eerie efficiency. These were not chaotic purges, but cold operations sanctioned by decree and executed without fanfare. The Janissaries, bound by their oath to the Sultan but also swayed by factional politics, became tools in a dangerous game of internal control. They ensured that dissent, real or perceived, was dealt with swiftly. But loyalty in the palace was never absolute. At times, Janissaries turned from instruments of justice to agents of ambition, aligning with rival court factions or acting in self-interest to maintain their influence. Janissaries' role in toppling sultans, their power to install or remove sultans, was not theoretical. It was practiced, deliberate, and devastatingly real. Sultan Osman II was the first clear example, a young reformer who sought to curb the Janissaries' autonomy. His assassination in 1622, carried out after he tried to form a rival force, was a chilling precedent and unspoken message to all who would follow. Reform, if it touched the Janissary Corps, would not be tolerated. In 1807, this pattern repeated with Sultan Selim III. Known for his forward-thinking reforms, Selim aimed to modernize the military through the Nizam-Waisetid, or New Order Army. But the Janissaries saw this as a direct threat to their position. They revolted, deposed him, and ultimately ensured his death-choosing. Instead, a more pliant ruler in Mustafa IV. These were not simply copes, they were redefinitions of power. When a military elite can dethrone the monarch they were sworn to protect, the empire's hierarchy becomes inverted. The Sultan may have been at the head of the empire, but the Janissaries held the true reins of power. By toppling sultans, the Janissaries not only shaped Ottoman history, they carved the boundaries of power itself. proving that in an empire ruled by sword and silence, the blade could point in any direction. The decline of the Janissary Corps, from warriors to mercenaries by the 18th century, the Janissary Corps had evolved into a powerful but increasingly corrupt force. What had once been a disciplined and loyal military unit had become a self-serving mercenary force, more interested in maintaining its own power than serving the empire. The Janissaries were no longer the elite warriors they once were. They had become entangled in the empire's politics, and in doing so, had lost sight of their original purpose. Their decline was marked by an increasing inability to adapt to new military technologies and tactics. The Janissaries resisted modernization efforts, fearing that any changes would erode their power and influence. This refusal to evolve left them vulnerable to internal challenges and external threats. The Janissary Corps, once a symbol of Ottoman strength, had become an obstacle to the empire's survival. The final blow to the Janissary Corps came in 1826 with the establishment of the Nizam-Waisetid, or New Order Army, a modernized force intended to replace the Janissaries. The Janissaries, feeling threatened by this new military force, rose up in revolt. However, this time they were met with resistance. The Sultan, Mahmud II, crushed the Janissary uprising with brutal efficiency. The corps was disbanded, marking the end of an era in Ottoman history. The legacy of the Janissaries: power, rebellion, and the fall of an empire. The Janissaries left a legacy that was both impressive and destructive. They were the heart of the Ottoman military for centuries, shaping the empire's power and politics in ways that no other force could. But their rise to power also brought about their downfall. The Janissaries' ability to challenge the Sultan and manipulate the political landscape made them a force to be reckoned with. In the end, however, their inability to adapt to the changing world around them sealed their fate. The Janissary Corps, once the pride of the Ottoman Empire, is now remembered as both a symbol of imperial power and a cautionary tale of unchecked military influence. Their story is one of power, rebellion, and the ultimate decline of an empire that was unable to control the very force it had created. As the empire faltered, the Janissaries' legacy continued to reverberate through history. Their rise and fall serve as a reminder of the dangers of power that is not kept in check and the fragility of empires that fail to evolve. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's blade, became the force that eventually cut down the empire they had helped build.